welcome to the third in our series of videos about the origins and development of the early Cold War. This is a revision tool for your GCSE History examination. It's not everything you need to know about the topic of superpower rivalry, but it's a good start. So, the rivalry between the two superpowers, the USA on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other, was the defining feature of the post-war period, what we come to refer to as the Cold War. The Cold War was fought in four main ways and with four main tools. It was fought through espionage. The great powers spied on one another in order to discover one another's military and industrial secrets. It was fought through loans and aid. The United States provided aid through the Marshall Plan or the European Recovery Program. The USSR had Comecon, its mechanism for pumping money into the economies of Eastern Europe, where it was in charge. It was fought through propaganda. Both sides competed aggressively to show the other in as negative a light as possible. The USA attempted to show communism as an almost demonic force, something that would corrupt the morals and values of Western society. And the Soviet Union did much the same in relation to capitalism and the values of the West. But by far the most important way in which the Cold War developed, by far the most important source of tension between the two superpowers, was the arms race. The arms race consisted of competition to develop both conventional and also nuclear weapons. The USA became the first nuclear power in human history in 1945 with its nuclear tests at Los Alamos. The Soviet Union initially was unable to replicate this success, but two things changed that. The first was the success of Soviet espionage in the United States, which succeeded in extracting some of the technological secrets necessary to manufacture their own atomic bomb. The second was the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, where large deposits of raw uranium were discovered, a critical material necessary for the manufacture of an atomic bomb. So by 1949, the Soviet Union was able to manufacture its own atomic bomb, and it became the second superpower in human history. From this point forward, the two superpowers began to stockpile weapons in what became known as the global arms race. And that arms race was characterized by paranoia on both sides. In the United States, there was frequent discussion of both a bomber gap and a missile gap. And it's important to remember that at this period in history, until about 1957 in fact, atomic bombs, like any other type of bomb, were principally likely to be delivered by bomber aircraft. So without bomber aircraft capable of flying over a territory and dropping a weapon, atomic or otherwise, that weapon was strategically pretty useless. It wasn't until 1957 that discussion of the bomber gap was replaced by discussion of the missile gap, because at that point in time, the United States and very quickly the Soviet Union manufactured intercontinental ballistic missiles, meaning missiles that could be fired from one continent onto another. That massively extended the range of their atomic threat to one another. Up to that point, it was necessary for them to have bases to refuel their bombers or to launch their bombers, and those bases had to be quite close to the intended country where they were against which they were launching their attack. With the invention of ICBMs in the late 50s, that changed dramatically. Now, the two nations were able to fire weapons at one another across vast distances, and this led to the situation widely referred to as MAD, M-A-D, or mutually assured destruction. And that is the defining feature of the Cold War, the point in superpower relations where it has become simply too dangerous for the two countries involved, for the United States and the Soviet Union, to risk going to war with one another, because war between the two superpowers would almost by definition mean nuclear war, and nuclear war meant annihilation for both parties. In order to guard against this possibility, but also to take forward their strategic rivalry, the two superpowers established their own network of alliances. For the United States, that meant NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a military alliance of Western powers designed to defend Western Europe against the threat of communist expansion. 6 years later, in 1955, that was followed by the Warsaw Pact, which was an alliance of communist states led by the Soviet Union, with the intention of resisting NATO, of building up an armed camp in the east of Europe. And this was a direct response to NATO and to what Stalin regarded as the threat posed by NATO. Now, although Stalin had died by 1955, the Soviet Union's leadership under Nikita Khrushchev still believed that NATO was not a defensive organisation, but an offensive organisation. An organisation designed not only to resist the expansion of communism, but ultimately to roll back its borders. And at this point, the Cold War ratcheted up to an even higher level of tension, because we had two armed camps facing one another in Europe, the high point of international tension between these two powers.